and you can share your screen and I'll mute myself.
Right. So firstly, I want to thank you guys for having me this evening. The advantage, if it will, of Plague Times is that we can have meetings like this, and I can still teach in the morning to my biology students. So there is some advantage to our delightful Plague Times. So this evening I'm here to discuss where's the loo and where can I get a drink, an analysis of private latrines and public water fountains in Pompeii. So when most of you think about the Roman world, you probably think about things like grand architectural achievements and great buildings and constructions, perhaps fancy mosaics and colorful painted frescoes. And what you probably don't think about is toilets. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So much of Roman archaeology has spent a really significant amount of time thinking about these really grand, fancy, elaborate aspects of behavioral culture, and has sort of, up until fairly recently, kind of glossed over what it is like to actually live in the Roman world. What is it really like for people in more diverse economic settings than simply in elite housing? So, if you had a thought about what Roman sanitation looked like, it may have been these very elaborate multi-seat latrines. We see these big latrine features in a lot of large urban sites. There are a fair number of them in smaller Roman sites as well. In the right-hand corner, upper right-hand corner, that's actually a multi-seat latrine that's in a villa in Sicily, so a private household. But there's some sort of classic features of these kinds of large-scale sanitation projects, including these keyhole-shaped stone seats, usually seated over a large drainage feature, often but not always connected into a sewer network or a larger sort of management system. They frequently have gutters in front of the street, in front of the seats, through which water would have flowed. The exact purpose of those is somewhat in question. And they often had pools of water near the entrance for also somewhat uncertain purposes, as to whether that was for cleaning yourself or cleaning other parts of the latrine. But in reality, there's actually far more single seat or private latrines throughout the Roman world. We find these single seat or sometimes two seat latrines in Roman sites across Italy and then across the Roman Empire in whole. And they have some similarities. Occasionally you find stone seats, but far more common would have been wooden seats. And architecturally, we find slots or shelves on the wall where the seat would have rested. They can sometimes be constructed into a niche, which helps with the drainage system as it better positions the toilet user directly over the opening for the drains. They frequently have sloping tile floors. This is a really nice example of a tile floor. in Herculaneum, which is a few miles up the road from us. And they often have some sort of drainage collection system into a cesspit, or less frequently into a sewer network. And in some cases, there's efforts to provide ventilation or lighting through the addition of windows and spacing in the room. However, there's a whole different side of this sanitation picture, which really wasn't being discussed frequently in the literature until I started my master's thesis work, and that is upper story latrines. So this is an upper story latrine. It's on the second floor of a pretty grand house. It would have been located in an apartment that was accessed by a staircase off the street next to the big house, although the big house may have owned that property space. It has a lot of features that we see in those ground floor latrines. It's constructed into a niche. It's got slots for that wooden seat. It has sloping floors, which directs the waste material into the drainage chamber. So all kinds of components that we sort of expect to see in a Roman latrine on the ground floor. It's just upstairs. And we have archaeological evidence of these being on second and third stories in Pompeii, but at other sites, there's some indication that these may have been as high up as 6 stories tall in sites near Rome. And they're being drained by downpipes. Most frequently, the downpipes are made of terracotta, little tile segments that are set into each other. However, we occasionally find them being made out of metal, most frequently lead. And these are all over the site of Pompeii. Often we find downpipes in areas in which we can't necessarily see what the upper floors look like, so the pipe might be all that we have. Sometimes these are constructed into a masonry buttress. So they kind of just sort of wedge it in a corner and then cover the whole thing over with mud. And this is perhaps one of my most favorite upper story latrines, because everyone has to have their favorite. This is a second story latrine that was located on a balcony. So I'm currently taking this photo. I am standing in the street. On the other side of this doorway, there is a staircase that came up to the second floor inside a pretty significant sized house. Those are the beam holes for the floor. And then you can see the downpipe that's leading underneath of it. So somebody would have come out onto their balcony that was overhanging the street and gone into their latrine room, which is pretty nifty. It's the only one like that we have in Pompeii. In addition to these sort of latrines themselves, we often have a lot of accompanying features that play into the role of sanitation. There are sewer networks. It depends a little bit on the site as to whether or not sewers are extensive or fairly uncommon. In Pompeii itself, they're not particularly common, but in some cases, they're really fairly massive engineering works in themselves. We also have personalized products like chamber pots, which we'll talk about more in a few minutes, but they actually played probably a pretty significant role in the sanitation system for elites. If you were a well-to-do person, based on where latrines are found, you probably weren't using the toilet yourself. You were probably being brought a chamber pot, which was then emptied by somebody who is either a servant or a slave in your household. Chamber pots are also probably more frequent in rural settings. If you've got a whole, 100-acre plot of land out back, you don't necessarily need a place for your sanitation system to be particularly organized. You've got plenty of places to dump your waste, essentially. And then related to this, and we'll talk more about this later, but fountains are playing a really important role in the sanitation system in Pompeii, because those upper story latrines are being flushed with water from the public fountains. So one of the most frequently cited ideas about Roman sanitation is the sponge on a stick. I don't know if it's Kim to San Diego or Southern California, but there is a traveling exhibit on Pompeii that is very good, with one exception, in that they have this display, a bunch of tools and things that you can hold, and one of them is the sponge on a stick. And when it was in Denver, I ended up getting into quite the discussion and debate with the folks that were being docents that day about the issues with the sponge on a stick. So the sponge on a stick is an idea that comes from Roman sources. The writer Seneca writes of a gladiator who, faced with death in the arena, decides that that's not the way out that he wants. He wants to go out on his own terms. So he requests to use the lavatory and goes into the lavatory and takes the sponge stick for the vilest purposes and stuffs it down his throat, suffocating himself. And that is a reference to a sponge on a stick. There is really no archaeological evidence for any sort of stick sponge latrine combination. Now, to fair points to archaeology, evidence of absence is not absence of evidence. Both the wood and sponge are organic materials. So are we not finding these because they are not present, or are we not finding these because they have degraded and we just don't find them archaeologically? From sort of a public health standpoint, we know that the parasite load in the Roman world was fairly high. There was probably a fair amount of digestive issues related to different parasites and things like that. However, the sponge on a stick is either taking that parasite load to a monumentally frightening place, if these things are shared between members of households, or communal in those large multi-seat facilities, or these are incredibly cumbersome items if, to go to the bathroom at any point in the day, you have to carry around your poop stick with you wherever you go. So there's some technological aspects of these that are not particularly useful. And because we don't really have anything more than this sort of cursory explanation for what this stick is doing in the bathrooms, was this sponge on a stick there for cleaning yourself, or was it there as part of cleaning the lavatory? Was this part of cleaning the latrines? And as a result, they had these. This gutters in front of those seats on the multi-seats have been discussed in sort of the same way. Are these used for washing your hands after you use the facilities? Are these being used as makeshift latrine or urinals that are sort of just there and open flowing? And many possibilities could easily be in place there. Alternatively, there are a lot of different organic substances that could have been used as ancient toilet paper. I know many of us back in March and April were contemplating what life in a paperless society might entail for us. And we're thinking about different things like, well, what am I going to do there? There's often, it's often been suggested as well that you may have had sort of the Middle Eastern European attitude where one hand is for saying hello and the other hand is for cleaning yourself. So there's a lot of different things out there that are perhaps more practical than the sponge on a stick. But the sponge on a stick brings us to a really important sort of intellectual background of Roman sanitation research, which is sort of the battle between the pessimists and the optimists. So the pessimists cite ancient elite sources that are complaining about overcrowding, dead bodies in the street, waste piling up everywhere, people throwing chamber pots out the windows, and just say the past was a terribly horrible, smelly, disgusting place. And the whole sanitation system was bad and it wasn't a good situation. They frequently complain about things like odors would have been particularly noxious, and the unsanitary nature of the sponge and the stick and placement of latrines in kitchens as evidence that it was a whole big mess. Whereas the optimists typically are more focused on the archaeological remains of sanitation. They tend to point towards things like the remains of toilets and latrine features, bath complexes, efforts towards flush water and availability of flush water, efforts towards lighting and ventilation, and the large number of features in Pompeii as indications that, maybe for its time, things weren't so bad in the ancient Roman world in terms of sanitation. In reality, it's really probably somewhere in the middle. Latrines were unquestionably very smelly places. If you have ever used a open cesspit latrine, gone to a concert and used a porta potty, they are not pleasantly smelling places. And essentially that's what we have here. These are open cesspit draining features. There will be associated odors. However, they've done a lot of research studies in developing world countries and have found that if you are habitually using that kind of sanitation feature, you don't notice the smell. Your body acclimates to those kinds of smells pretty quickly. And for those who habitually use those kind of sanitation features, it probably wasn't a big deterrent in your use or function of those facilities. And again, if you were well-to-do, you probably weren't a direct toilet user, with the exception of a couple of features that have some sort of unusual placements, such as this latrine from Hadrian's Villa, which is outside of Rome, which is positioned right next to an elite dining room. So if you had a big banquet hall, maybe you've got a latrine that's kind of close by so that your guests can kind of pop in there as you're dining. But in most cases, we think chamber pots were probably what the rich individuals were using. Ladies, I have unfortunate news, or perhaps good news, depending on how you feel about those multi-seat latrines. Women probably didn't use them. By the Augustan era, so at the beginning of the Roman Empire, the Emperor Augustus put in a huge morality clause and morality conditioning, and associated with that was the end of mixed-sexed bathings and a lot of changes in propriety between men and women interactions. And as a result, certainly if you were a reputable, outstanding lady, you probably did not use the multi-seat latrines. So you probably had to wait until you got home or visited the house of a guest or a friend or family, something of that nature. With the exception of in this Augustan period, we do start to see in big bath complexes divided bathing complexes for men and women. And in some of those, they do install, as part of the women's changing area, a women's latrine, typically much smaller than the men's latrine. But while Pompeii does have a lot of toilets, they probably don't have enough toilets for everyone. And the streets were a dirty, dirty place. In Pompeii specifically, the streets are actually being used partly as a stormwater drainage system. So they have a large curbstone, and on the street surface itself, there would have been animal waste from cart traffic and things like that, as well as probably household rubbish that's getting pitched out the windows, because the Romans tell us that happens. And in some cases, we've actually found essentially at the end of this road is everybody's neighborhood dump. And so there's big piles of rubbish in the road. The roads were clearly dirty because the Romans actually installed stepping stones, which allowed pedestrians to cross the street without stepping down into the street traffic itself. So Roman sanitation is really an adaptation to specific problems at specific times. In various Roman sites, we see vastly different adaptations to really the same problem. In Rome, we see these massive sewer networks getting installed to drain baths and rainwater. It's a there's a large section of the Roman site that is in sort of a floodplain marshy zone. And as the development of the city grew, they eventually reached a point where they needed that land, and developing a large sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, which literally means big hole, is a way for them to manage the stormwater system, as well as accommodate all of the drainage from these big bath complexes. In Ostia, which is the port of Rome and just a few miles away, you also have some low-lying land issues, and as a result, you've got some desire to drain some of that facility away. But you also have the accommodations for a large population of essentially transient people. You've got all these tradespeople and sailors coming in between the port and Rome, and as a result, because you're trying to encourage a large body of your population that is not a permanent resident and therefore doesn't have a home to go back to use the facilities. So you avoid them using your streets as facilities by putting multi-seat latrines on darn near every corner in the city. We had quite the scavenger hunt the first time my team went there, because it was literally, look, there's another multi-seat latrine, and oh, look, there's another multi-seat latrine. But they're trying to solve this really specific problem in that you've got a lot of people who are wandering around your town who don't necessarily have permanent accommodations. Just up the road from us in Herculaneum, they have a very different soil matrix. Pompeii gets hit by lapilli when Vesuvius blows up, which is a very light material. It's very porous, and as a result, it drains very well if you have a cesspit. Herculaneum gets hit by mud flows. It's very, very dense clay material. It does not drain very well. And we actually have Roman records of the Romans complaining about the fact that their cesspits don't work. And so near to the end of the city's life, they actually install a sort of citywide network to drain waste material. And as a result, you see all the sanitation features down the block in the exact same place to connect into that sewer line. So when I started my master's thesis work way back when, there were a couple of research questions that I was most interested in. First, I wanted to know how many sanitation features were present in the city and how they were distributed. It seems like such a small thing, but no one had bothered to count. And there really wasn't a lot of quantitative data that had gone into any of the sanitation research that had occurred up to that point. And we had a couple of really prevalent theories or hypotheses out there that I wasn't convinced were accurate based on research in the ground. And one of those was to test the hypothesis that almost every house in Pompeii had a latrine. That's a lovely statement to say, but if you haven't counted how many sanitation features there are, that means almost nothing. So the other question, or one of the other questions I wanted to know, was how sanitation features were distributed within properties. And this was to test, again, another really prevalent theory that was out there in the literature, that that most latrines were located in kitchens. Cool, but like, what is most? We could actually quantify that and know what that distribution really looked like. And then I wanted to know the role of downpipes in the overall sanitation system, because it was colloquially known that these downpipes were related to upper story sanitation features, but again, nobody had looked at how they were distributed across the city. So in a couple of years of research and survey, we found 254 private latrines plus 13 multi-story or multi-seat latrines, and 286 downpipes with 23 associated upper story latrines. When you look at this in the breakdown between residential and business properties, for ground floor latrines, there are 164 residential latrines, or 1 latrine for every 2 residences, and 97 residential downpipes, or 1 downpipe for every 4 residences. In businesses, there are 85 latrines on the ground floor, which is 1 for every 7 properties, and 189 downpipes, or 1 downpipe for every 3 businesses. Now, you're probably doing the math in your head already and thinking, boy, it doesn't really sound like every house has a latrine. And in fact, no. Citywide, the ratio is about 1 feature per every 2 properties. And there is a strong correlation between businesses having downpipes more commonly and residential properties more commonly having ground floor latrines. And I very quickly thought, I think there's something more going on here. And we'll get to that here in a sec. So this is a map of Pompeii. The black line around the outside is a city wall. And there are 3 denser concentrations of ground floor latrines. And these largely corresponds to heavily residential areas of the city, where there's sort of mid-sized houses fairly common. That region up in the northeast corner is a specific district in which I think this notion of almost every house has a latrine comes from, because up in that region, almost every house really does have a latrine. It's a very residential area, and latrine presence is fairly common, and it was an area that was pretty heavily surveyed by earlier researchers. So I think this is where that idea is coming from. When we look at the downpipe distribution, you see a pretty heavy concentration in sort of the middle urban core of the city. And this is directly west of the Forum, which is sort of a big meeting place, city's civic center sort of area of the city. And towards the more western section, the presence of downpipes really just drops off altogether. And this is, I think, a reflection of urban density. Where we have less available space, properties are much smaller, and more people are looking to move up than further in the western half of the city, where you have larger garden plots, much bigger property sizes, you have a little bit more space on the ground floor level. There appears to be a concentration, that dotted yellow line, of upper story latrines in the middle of the city. This is largely an artifact of preservation and not actually a factor of latrine presence. When Vesuvius erupted, the first couple waves of the attack of these superheated gas clouds that were collapsing off the mountain come down and they hit the city wall, and the city wall is able to stop it. One of the last ones in terms of the lifespan of the citizens of Pompeii has enough force that when it comes down, it hits the city wall and goes over top of it. And it actually has enough force that it can shear the walls and rooftops of buildings off at the height of the city wall. So this particular region where we find a lot of upper story latrines is an artifact of the fact that that is a low spot in the city relative to the height of the wall. So in that region, we sometimes get we frequently get second story preservation, but we often sometimes get a little bit of the third story preserved as well. Whereas in some of the other regions of the city, we might only have wall height up to your hip. So if you only have hip high walls, you're not going to see the second floor to see if there was a latrine up there. So now that we know a little bit about the distribution of these latrines across the city as a whole and how many of them there are, we can start to look at where they're found within properties. So again, this part of the project was designed to test the hypothesis that Pompeian latrines are found in kitchens. And sure enough, 52% of latrines in residential properties are found in kitchens. So yes, most of them are found in kitchens. However, 48% of them are not found in kitchens, and summarizing things in that kind of way is missing a vast amount of variation that we actually see. So when we break this down by the size of the property, in larger houses, we tend to see them in the kitchen. Well, for all size houses, we tend to find a lot of them in kitchens. However, there is a more statistically significant trends for them being in kitchens in those big houses. In medium-sized houses, there is a statistical connection with them being near the rear entrance, which together suggests that those who are using these facilities are probably not the people who are using the house or who own the house. Kitchens, service areas, rear entrances where tradespeople might enter the house are probably not going to be frequently accessed by the big wealthy person who owns the house. So this is part of, I think, the support that we were really looking for wealthy individuals getting a chamber pot, which is then emptied by a servant, because we find these in more surface areas. Differently, however, are the small houses. In the small houses, they put them right next to the front door. And if you think about your house now and the location of your powder room, it's probably pretty close to your front door, or those kind of generalized living spaces. Because not only are you a direct user of your latrine feature, but your guests are direct users of your latrine feature, and you want it to be in a convenient location. I also suspect that for these smaller income households, there may have been some pride in having a latrine feature because only half the residents in Pompeii have one. So it might have been something that you showed off to your guests. Oh, would you like to use the latrine? It's right here near the door in this convenient location just for you. So I think this reflects the fact that in these lower income households, the latrine users themselves are actually the homeowners as well as perhaps their staff. And as a result, they want it in a place that is more conveniently accessible to them, as well as their guests. Residential downpipes, there are not a ton of them. Most of them are located on exterior streets. They're kind of just sort of stuffed wherever it's convenient to place them. They frequently put them in locations where they can tie into a ground floor latrine. And it is true that we have to keep into account that the room that it's found in the ground floor is not the room that it's actually being accessed, because the toilet itself was upstairs. So the space that was upstairs, we may or may not be able to get a firm idea of what was going on up there. So where's the loo in a residential property? Yes, kitchens were an important location. The kitchens would have had access to plenty of flush water. Often latrines are being used as rudimentary garbage disposals or other household rubbish places. So having one in your kitchen is a fairly convenient location, as that's a good place to pitch other rubbish as well. But importantly, entrances and small dedicated latrine rooms are also very important for the overall picture of where one might put their latrine. In larger houses, we tend to see these more placed in service areas, whereas in the smaller houses, they're right up near the front door. Business latrines on the ground floor, again, they're kind of like the residential downpipes, not very many of them. They tend to be put in back areas of the properties, tend to be in small dedicated latrine rooms, tend to be fairly removed from general business operations. What we have a lot of is downpipes in our business properties. So that's suggesting that the latrine feature is actually upstairs. In sort of hospitality businesses, they're not particularly common, but they are prevalent in these 1 to 2 room workshops. So you frequently have, and you can have whole bunches of them in streets all lined up, and you'll have a latrine or a downpipe in the back wall of that 1 room shop. And that's because these downpipes and latrine features on upper stories are serving a very specific community in Pompeii. They're apartment dwellers. So in a lot of these 1 room tiny shops, they had mezzanine or kind of balcony apartments above that shop. If you live in this shop and run the shop, your house is upstairs, that's where you want your latrine. And as a result, you have a whole slew of these little shops that have upper story latrines being drained by a downpipe in the city, in this kind of urban core where space is at a premium and you've only got this little bit of space, and your space is so constricted that you put your toilet upstairs where you're living and where it's convenient. So for our business properties, it's a little bit of a case that we're not unfamiliar with. The bathrooms are kind of for customers only. The latrines that are placed in hospitality shops like restaurants and things like that, where there's more common to have them on the ground floor, they tend to be kind of like behind the kitchen in a back room. Like, you probably weren't going to find that space unless somebody was telling you it's back over there. You know, you've got to go through the kitchen and then around the corner and out by the back. However, in our little workshops, they're putting the latrine upstairs, and these are probably not latrines that are being utilized by customers in that shop, but people who are living above that shop in little apartments that are up there. So shifting focus a little bit, what some of our more recent research has been looking at is drinking water systems. Specifically, we're looking at those public water fountains, which is what I'm going to talk about today, which are so important for those apartment dwellers because this is how they are getting water. This is how they're flushing their upper story latrines. and they're important for a lot of working workshops and things like that and industrial use. But we're also doing a lot of work looking at private water for drinking and display. The piped water system is being used fairly extensively for elites to show off with water as well. But we're going to focus in on the drinking fountains. So in the 1st century BCE, the Romans install the Aqua Augusta, which is an aqueduct system which was built to supply Pompeii sort of peripherally and a number of sites along the Bay of Naples, including the big naval station that's up on the north end of the bay. In Pompeii, the effects were widespread with increased water for a growing number of baths, water for private display features, and the installation of these public drinking fountains. There are 42 of these fountains. There are actually now 43 because in the new excavation, you may have seen stuff in the news about new finds and things like that. They actually have a new public fountain up in that part of the excavation. So there are now 43, but I haven't seen it yet. And 36 of these that have a large basin. And when we started this research, it was to look at the estimated calculations for volume, which we suspected were a little bit off because we think that some of the other researchers had failed to account for a couple of the features. So there are a number of features on these basin fountains that I'm going to talk about. First, we have the spout stone, which extends above the basin and includes the spout, and in most cases, the decorative relief. This one is not decorated. The basin stones, which we numbered arbitrarily clockwise, starting with the stone under the spout. Most fountains have a drain on the bottom, as well as an overflow on the rim. And then on the interior, several of the fountains have a fillet or a rimmed edge of concrete, which helps seal the seams on the bottom between the stones. What we were most concerned about when we were looking at volume is we were not certain that that other researchers had accounted for the overflows and the fillets in their estimates of volume. So a significant amount of math done later. The average volume of the fountain basins is 660 liters. In general, some of the previous researchers were about 10% higher than what our estimates for volume were. And again, we think this is largely because those overflows and fillets were not being taken into account with their calculations. However, in one case, we were even surprised by how much it was off. Fountain 20 was overestimated by almost 40% by other previous published estimates. In looking at these fountains, we quickly discovered there was a lot of other things we could record in addition to our measurements for volume. It's been suggested that fountain spouts were unique and could be used as directional landmarks in the cities. Our results do not support this notion. While some of the spouts are unique, several designs are repeated in locations across the city. For example, bull designs are repeated in 4 instances, and the sort of bullseye plate pattern is found in 6 fountains. And some of these are remarkably similar. The most common designs are religious or mythological figures, several of which are associated with water or wine drinking, such as Salinas. Unlike the local well water and collected rainwater, the aqueduct water contains a higher mineral content, specifically calcium, and the deposition of calcium carbonate has been used as evidence that downpipes drained upper story latrines based on the fact that they were flushed with aqueduct water. In several water and sanitation features, as a result, we have found really significant measurable amounts of accumulation of this calcium deposit. So we expected to find lots of evidence for calcium deposits on our fountains, and we didn't. 28 of them show no trace of calcium, while the remainder displayed really pretty faint traces. Two patterns of residue emerge. Most commonly, we see this sort of splash pattern, which is found under the stone 1 beneath the spout. And this appears to be consistent with water falling onto the floor and then splashing up or spraying from the spout. The second pattern is water lines. Of the fountains with water lines, most of the water lines only raised to about half or 2/3 of the way up the slab, generally well below the overflow. And what we found through some accidental experimental archaeology is, in fact, this pattern appears on our fountains. Several of these have been replumbed with modern water. We see this kind of pattern of water underneath the spout stone and water lines that go about halfway up when water hits an empty basined fountain. While calcium carbonate deposition is rare, other signs of water wear are more common. All the fountains except 7 have water patterns consistent with water erosion below the spout opening, so on the spout stone itself. In some cases, it makes identifying the design of the spout fairly complicated. As will become a trend, the fountains with heavier wear are located on major roads that exit through the city, and moderate wear ones are also on major public thoroughfares or near important public buildings. We started looking at use wear because it can be informative in determining how water was collected from the fountains. All the basin of fountains except 1 have some use wear on the rim of the basin. The use wear was ranked from light, where there's just a slight polish, to extreme, where the stone has been worn into a saddle shape. Light wear was found on 9 fountains. Moderate wear was found on 8 fountains. Heavy wear, which was most common, was found on 15, while 2 were shown to have extreme wear. And here we can see that those with significant water wear are also those that tend to have more significant use wear and are located on these major thoroughfares leading into and out of the city. So with our use wear, we started to notice that looking at the fountain as a whole wasn't really capturing the entire picture of where this use really was. So we started looking at it based on the individual stones. Use wear was generally heavier and most commonly present on stone 1. In general, use wear on stone 2 and 4 is located closer to the spout stone and tended to be lighter than stone 1. With the exception of 1 fountain, which is in a weird spot, which is why I think it has this, use wear is completely absent from stone 3. Stone 3 was usually located in the middle of the roadway rather than on the sidewalk, which is why I think that 1 fountain is weird, because it's actually placed up against a wall. So accessing water from behind it would have been challenging. So the common image of Pompeii water fountains is that of these large fountains that were landmarks on the urban landscape because of their unique fountain spouts that were constantly overflowing with a beautiful, magnificent supply of water that was so prolific that it could wash the streets. We can imagine people lined up to fill containers from these full basins to carry back to their shops and homes. Perhaps draft animals came up to the edge for a drink while their owners unloaded carts. And visitors to town could have received directions to turn left at the Fountain of the Comedy Mask to reach the Forum. While the addition to public drinking water undoubtedly had a profound impact on urban development in Pompeii, our results suggest that there are a lot of misconceptions about how these fountains operated, and that with a little bit more detailed analysis, we can kind of clarify our understanding. While the Fountain of Fortuna, pictured here, might have been a noticeable landmark for people meeting on the edge of the Forum, we use it on occasion when our project team is divided. We'll be like, okay, well, we'll meet here on the edge of the Forum at Fortuna. If you directed your visitors to turn left at the plate or the bowl, it might have left them terribly lost in the city. The duplication of some of these shapes with the plates and the cattle and sort of indescript mythological features would have made fountains fairly complex to difficult to use as a landmark. The lack of measurable calcium carbonate accumulation and the limited staining remains a bit of a puzzle for us for such important water features. But if the fountains were filled for the majority of their use, we'd expect there to be some trace of it. The minimal staining and the most frequently patterns reminiscent of this splashing water and water lines below the overflow does not support the idea that these were constantly filled to overflowing, and were perhaps rarely filled to overflowing, and that most of them were draining out of the lower drains and not from the top. Analysis of the useware provides insights into how fountains were used on a daily basis. We might have expected a more even distribution of wear if the water had been taken from filled basins and people could access that water from anywhere around there. However, the concentration and increasing intensity of wear near the spout stone suggests water was collected directly from the spout rather than from the water in the basin itself. The wear also suggests that water was generally collected from the sidewalk and not from people standing in the street or along the side of the fountain. The cause of the wear is another aspect of this discussion. One idea that's been put out is that the wear was caused by people placing their hands on the rim of the fountain while leaning over to collect water from the spout, like a giant drinking fountain. If this was the case, we might predict that the wear would be more intense on one side of the other as a reflection of hand dominance. However, the distribution of wear does not seem to indicate any preference in the side of the spout. And most fountains have use wear on both sides at fairly equal rates. Further, if hands were being the cause of the wear, we might expect to find concentration of the wear on the top of the stone slab for the best kind of balance and grip. And in fact, we find wear on the inside edge, frequently several centimeters down the into the basin, far lower than we would expect a hand to sort of slide as you were sort of leaning over the spout. Alternatively, we suggest the pattern is probably more consistent with containers, most likely ceramic, although wood is possible, that are being tilted under this water flow of the spout and then dragged back out of the basin maybe with the assistance of ropes, although I'm less convinced of that for Pompeii than I am for Herculaneum. Extracting the container would be consistent with the wear on the inside edge, as the ceramic vessel or wood material rubbed along that edge as it's being pulled out. Also consistent with our observations, removing a container could be performed on either side of the spout without too much difficulty, as the user could stand fairly squarely during that lifting process. Now you know where you can get a drink and find a loo in ancient Pompeii. And a special shout out to the Soprintendenza of Culture in Naples and Pompeii, as well as the current, although soon to be departing, Superintendent Massimo Sana, as well as our colleagues at Bright Paleohydraulic Institute, and our delightful field students from 2018 and 2019, and maybe 2021. We shall see.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kate. That was really interesting and very informative. And I think there's going to be, I'll read off some questions that we have in the chat here. The first one was from Judy, who said, regarding the toilet features adjacent to the dining area, I've read that at high-end banquets, guests often gorge themselves, left to vomit when what they had consumed, and then return to gorge themselves some more. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, so the vomitoriums were real things. As sort of a personal joke, when I did my first field season, we had one of our students. I was a student at the time, but one of our other students actually got heat stroke and ended up vomiting in one of the side rooms off of our excavation unit, which then became for the rest of the field project. And I still think of this room in Pompeii as the vomitorium, our own personal one. So this was a practice in the sort of later Roman Empire, which may have been part of the reason why Hadrian's Villa and a couple of these really, really massive complexes have latrines very close to the dining rooms. However, I suspect, like using the toilet themselves, there was probably a room where chamber pots would be delivered near the dining facility, and they just threw up in those. I don't think it was a particularly common trend. It was sort of, I think, a short-lived moment while this sort of kind of rejection or rebellion against sort of some of the morality things that had been going on a few emperors before. There was a period in which being as excessive as you possibly could be was the mark of being wealthy. And pretty quickly, a couple emperors later, that kind of just gets knocked on its butt, and using your wealth for benevolence becomes the more popular scheme again. And I don't think it was a long-lived trend, and it was very restricted to the upper echelons of society.
Okay. Marilyn wants to know, where were they washing clothes?
Washing clothes is a fun one. So in Pompeii, there are a vast number of laundries, which are called phallonicas in Roman, in Latin, where they had big vats for washing clothes. Most people would have sent out the majority of their clothes to a laundry of some description for them to be cleaned there. Fun facts, what they were using as ancient laundry soap? Urine. So distilled urine, urine is basically ammonia. Throughout the city, throughout the Roman world, historically, there were large vats that were present in front of a lot of laundry facilities in which urine could be collected. And we know that the urine trade was big business. As the Emperor Vespasian has the story telling that he put a tax on, he was very budget conscious, he put a tax on urine collection, and some big Roman executive comes in and was like, this is so distasteful, how are you putting a tax on this? And he was said to have taken out a handful of coins from his pocket and go, does it smell dirty to you? Saying that the tax was worth more than any inconvenience of said of urine tax.
Well, Christine wants to know, is that Vesuvius in the background of the photo?
Indeed. So both of these photos were taken in the Roman Forum. So this was the big market center of political and government and judicial systems in the city, and that is Vesuvius in the background. She is always looming as part of our daily life. We do have a volcano day planned should she wake up. It's largely to get drunk because the public transportation system is not sufficient for exit, but.
Judy has another question. What kind of stone was used for building the fountains and the basins?
So most of the fountains are made from a travertine lava stone. So it's a kind of a basalt, very hard, with little chunks of sort of almost obsidian in it. So basically they made it out of Vesuvius in the background from the previous time it blew up. Occasionally there's a couple of fountains that are made out of marble. And there is one fountain that has been installed really probably in just the last 5 to 10 years of the city's life, probably after the big earthquake that happens in 62 AD, that was made out of brick.
All right. Shannon wants to know, what type of artifacts have been found during excavations of the latrines?
So there have been surprisingly few excavations of latrines. In the 1912, one archaeologist excavated 3 of them and found what he called a foul dark earth, and commented on the fact that one of them was something like 30 feet deep. So we're talking a big hole to get all the way down to the bottom of the cesspit. In recent excavations in sort of the northwest corner, a couple of them were excavated. However, because of health and safety, we can only go down like a meter, maybe, if we're lucky and the Italians aren't watching too closely. They don't let us go particularly deep. However, in those, what has been found was a lot of household rubbish. They found just inside the drain of the latrine, a beautiful oil lamp, perfectly preserved. Somebody must have been super sad when they dropped that down the toilet. We frequently find small change. We frequently find food waste, so it can be a great source for phytoliths and paleobot stuff, as well as zooarchaeological material. Basically, the kinds of things that, you know, like if you dropped it into the toilet, would you go in after it, kind of thing.
That's fair. Javi wants to know, where did everything in the city ultimately drain to? If you know.
So the cesspits themselves are primarily self-contained, because in Pompeii the soil is very porous. Liquid materials drain away, and periodically they dug them out to collect the solid waste, because in the Roman world, the best manure you could have was people. So there were people whose business it was to empty out the cesspits and sell that to surrounding agricultural plots. The larger sewers drain sort of basically beyond the city wall, and in most cases there's a little bit of question as to what exactly terrain wise was out there. In one case there's a Sarno river, so they're just pumping it probably into the river, but in a couple of cases it's maybe going into the ocean or into the sea. However, we don't really know where the sea was. We don't know where Pompeii's harbor was. It was a big, busy, metropolitan, a little bit kind of gritty town. It surely had one, but for the life of us, we've not been able to find it yet.
And Shannon and Betsy have more important questions. Can you volunteer for field school, and who can participate?
Yes. We actually have an information session that is on Thursday. I will put so that's my email address if anyone is interested or has students who might be interested. We are an accredited field school through the University of Missouri. We do a study abroad program, so we can accept students who want credit. However, I have also made arrangements in previous seasons to have a couple of volunteers as well. We like people with archaeological backgrounds or interests, but a lot of our students don't have necessarily a ton of experience with classical archaeology or anything like that. In both 2018 and 2019, we were quite proud to have entirely female field school teams. It was kind of by happy accident, but it turned out great that we had two groups of really wonderful female students. Several of our students have gone on to grad school now. We had one student who ended up doing the McNair program through our field school. So we've been really lucky in our collection of folks. My co-director is 84 and British. So participation, participation is largely dependent on whether or not you can get yourself up the hill. And if he can, I imagine anyone of interest can probably do it too.
Okay. Jim says, for the medium houses, 56% of the toilets were in the kitchen, only 15 by the back door. Why did you highlight the back door for those? Also, where do the typical houses have the kitchens relative to the back door?
So kitchens are typically located in sort of the back end of the property. A lot of them are located close-ish to the back door. Um, if I classified something as next to a doorway, it needed to be essentially immediately next to the door. So frequently we have houses in which perhaps the kitchen is in the back and there might be a back door, um, uh, and you have a latrine feature. And if it's essentially in the kitchen space and not entire has a solid wall that's separating it from the rest of the kitchen features, or a solid wall and immediately adjacent to the back door, then we would typically classify it as being that way. Uh, Frequently, when we say they're in the kitchen, we mean there is typically at most a half wall, but frequently not even that. And the kitchen is next to what is equivalent to your oven, often abutting your oven. They frequently build the little platform for the seat right into the oven cooker kind of space.
Shannon says, did the fountains have metallic spouts that have gone missing?
Um, so this is part of the reason why we're all very interested to see what the new latrine or the new fountain looks like, because it's been excavated in modern times. They would have had lead spouts of some description. We find lead fittings occasionally in other types of water fountains, but not in these big public ones. When World War II hit, the site was heavily scavenged for lead. Basically, if there was lead that was easily accessed, it was ripped out at that point. So there's only a couple of sections where we actually see one of these water towers where the water was pressurized as it went through the city, which has a big section of their piping still in place.
Okay, the other two comments are about getting used to bad smelling things. Jim talking about a colony of 60,000 fur seals in Namibia, and Marilyn, who volunteered in Rancho La Brea, who said you get used to the tar pit smell, so you could understand where it would be. You would eventually get used to it. And
I mean, unquestionably, the ancient world was undoubtedly a very smelly place. But unless you were, a particularly or elite person who was constantly in recline next to a pretty garden with nice flowers in it and stuff like that, and being surrounded by sort of nicer smelling things, I suspect if you worked in the kitchen, for example, if you were a household servant or slave, you're going to be right next to it all day long, and it's not going to probably be any bother, and it will be there for you when you need it. And this is, I think, part of the reason why we're not seeing a lot of probably elite traffic through there, just because there would have been all kinds of things going on in sort of the back parts of the houses for those big houses. So,
yep. What looks like one more question from Alberto. Have there been comparative studies with public water fountains in Rome for use wear and calcium deposits? If you know.
There's been, I have not seen any studies about use wear. There's been a little bit about calcium deposits there, and in Naples. It more commonly in Naples, it's specific to the water source. So it just so happens that the water where the Aqua Augusta is coming from this mountain spring that has really high calcium in it, which is why we see this difference in comparison to the groundwater and the rainwater. Um, there are, I think there's two or three lines that are going into Rome that have higher calcium water deposits in it. Rome has a lot of aqueducts that feed it. The issue with Useware and Rome and some of their public fountains is a lot of the Roman fountain system was co-opted by medieval occupations and later occupations, and they just keep sticking fancier fountains in the same spots because the piping was already there and things like that. So a lot of the really fancy fountains we think about for modern Rome, where, like the Trevi fountain and stuff like that, that was originally on a Roman aqueduct line. And there's actually if you kind of go down a back alley behind that fountain, you can actually go underground, and you're at the Roman street level. And there was a house there, and there's a latrine down there, which is why I went down in the hole in the ground. But there's a bunch of city features and stuff like that, and a lot of that stuff has just been kind of co-opted into the modern architecture of the city. The nice thing about Pompeii, although they probably didn't feel that way at the time, was that volcano really covered everything, was a convenient way to prevent a lot of extra building and stuff going on top of it.
Okay, sorry, I had distraction from this cat. Are there any other questions for Dr. Kate tonight?
I have a kind of quick one. So in one of the images, it shows like the keyhole cut into the latrine, and so it has it on the top, and then it also has on kind of like the front side of it. Is there a reason it's on the front side?
So the most prevalent idea for this shape is that it allows gentlemen the option of position, where they could either sit or essentially use the drainage facility as a urinal, and it somehow was easier to position themselves that way. That's the most common reason, and they do this sometimes on the same kind of pattern on the seats on the single latrines when they're stone. So clearly, for however they were functioning, this was the way Romans liked their seat design. Yeah, because the smaller site, it's basically just a single household, and they still make their stone seats the same way. So,
all right. Any other questions, comments?
I do have one question. How did you get involved in Pompeii?
So everyone wants to know, how did the American archaeologist from Washington State end up studying Roman sanitation? And the answer to that is, when I was nearing my senior year of undergrad, I decided I'm probably going to do Northwest archaeology my whole career. This is what I've been trained to do. Just for funsies, we'll go to this field school in Italy that a couple of my other friends had gone to the previous year. And it was the Anglo-American project in Pompeii, which was a massive excavation of almost an entire city block from starting at 79 AD, going down to the foundation
Mm.
of the block. They worked there for almost 2 decades.
Mm.
It was a truly massive undertaking, and 2006 was the last year that they had open excavations.
Mm.
And that was the year that I ventured.
Mm.
By happenstance, I ended up becoming buddies with Dr. Barry Hobson, who's now my co-director of the field school. And we became friends. And one afternoon we had, or one day we had a free day. He told me, he's like, oh, I'm gonna go up to this site near Rome, and do you want to come along? And I was like, well, I don't have, it's an off day. What am I gonna do? Laundry? Yeah, sure, whatever. So we get in a car and we truck up, and the site he took me to was Ostia, which is where this latrine on the left is from. And it is the town of magical multi-seaters, and they literally are everywhere. And it was me wandering around in front of him, going like, look, I found another one. Look, I found another one. Look, I found another one. Well, he took pictures and documented them how he was going to document them as we were going through, because it had been his first time to that particular site. Essentially, I caught the bug from him.
Mm-hmm.
He was actually a medical doctor, and he retired and went to a lecture from the co-director of the Anglo-American project. And at the end of the lecture, he went up to the guy and said, will you let anybody go to the field school? And the guy was like, you can apply. And he ended up getting a master's degree, and he's written a couple of books about Roman sanitation and Pompeii, and we've been writing stuff together and whatnot for several years now. So that's how it all started.
Thank
It was
you.
a trap.
Thank you.
I have not gone back to Pacific Northwest archaeology yet.
Wonderful story. Thank you.
Okay, well, if no one else has any other questions or comments, I think we're gonna wrap it up for tonight. And thank you so much, Dr. Kate.
Thank you for having me.
Really appreciate your time tonight, and look forward to hearing more about it after your next field season.
Yeah, hopefully we get back out.
Yes, we all do.
Right.
So everyone else, we'll see you next month, and take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Kate.